Now turning to Iraq with a very disturbing story where Daesh terrorists have executed 250 girls in Iraq for refusing to become sex slaves. Now, the Kurdish Democratic Party says the girls were all killed in the northern city of Mosul. It says some of them were executed alongside their families for refusing to become sex slaves for their captors. Thousands of women and girls have been abducted, raped, forced into marriage, are sold as sex slaves by Daesh members in Iraq and Syria. The terrorist group runs frequent sex slave markets in areas under its control. Many of its victims have been from the Izadi Kurdish community in northern Iraq. Crossing over to London, joined by Middle East expert Mr. Zayd. Mr. Zayd, thank you so much for being with us. Another disturbing story coming out of Iraq this time, with more crimes being committed by Daesh. How are we continually seeing these things happen all the time and yet still have not been able to stop Daesh? If really the international so-called Western community is also involved with those supposedly in the region who are trying to combat Daesh terrorists, could they continue to wreak such havoc as they're doing, or how do you see it?
Well, the answer is simply no. They couldn't have continued doing that when we are actually approaching the 2-year anniversary of actually the occupation of Mosul. And we mustn't forget that large swathes of Iraqi territory was occupied, including Tikrit, which was liberated by the Popular Mobilization Forces, and also Jaffa Sakhar and Heat and other areas which have been, like Amelie, actively liberated by the Popular Mobilization Forces. Now, we mustn't forget that the U.S., when it actually intervened under the so-called U.S.-led coalition against ISIS, it actually sat on its hand, refusing to move against ISIS since starting from June up to August, when actually ISIS changed direction and moved towards Erbil. That was when the US decided to intervene, and it actually delayed its intervention until the mid of September, when the new Iraqi government was forged. Now, we mustn't forget also that when the US started its so-called bombing, it actually was merely window dressing. It wasn't effective at all. It wasn't efficient, and the bombings were few and far between. The whole idea was, according to the diktats of some of the major countries in the US coalition, that is Saudi Arabia, it actually dictated that what should happen to ISIS is simply weaken, contain it, but it must remain a viable, credible threat towards Syrian government, to topple the Syrian government, and also to dramatically weaken Iraq, bring it to its knees, and destabilize it, and use also ISIL as the main threat towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we mustn't forget also the veto put by Saudi Arabia that the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are the most effective, which have spearheaded the liberation of Iraq, including Tikrit and Amelie and Jaffa Sakhar, mustn't enter Anbar province, because they're, as we lately heard from its ambassador based in Iraq, that accused bluntly their Popular Mobilization Forces of being sectarian and mustn't enter the area of Anbar.
Okay,
now,
we'll stay with Mr. Zayd, because if that's the situation, you've talked about a whole wide range of things. Now, at this point in time, what needs to be done? We're talking about, of course, that Daesh basically is continuing to wreak this havoc everywhere. And we have seen, obviously, some progress in Iraq and in Syria, but obviously not the amount that it should be, especially if the so-called international community was really doing what it had to do. At this point in time, what has to happen in order for us to stop seeing this horror being repeated so many times?
Well, the main thing is that we must be able, that is the Iraqi government, to act basically and mustn't abide by or adhere to the diktats of the US or Saudi Arabia. That means it must use its most effective, efficient forces on the ground, that is the popular mobilization forces, to liberate, first and foremost, Fallujah, which is the Achilles heel for Baghdad, and then move on to Mosul. These practices of Daesh of enslaving women and forcing them into sex slavery is part and parcel of the widely embraced teaching and practices of Daesh, which adheres to the Takfiri ideology, which the leader of the SPD, that is the German party, who is partners to Merkel, said it is the same Wahhabi Salafi ideology that Saudi Arabia adheres to. Now, this, according to this practice, this is called sex slavery, which is part of their sexual jihad, where women are basically abducted and they are enslaved against their will, and if their families reject that, then they are executed.
Okay.
This has been commonly practiced against the Izadi women, and now it is practiced against women from Mosul.
All right, thank you so much. So sorry, I would love to talk to you more about this issue. Of course, a very sad situation is taking place today in Iraq. Thanks so much for being with us, Mr. Zayd, Middle East expert out of London.